Droid. The river had a way of making men believe they understood it, and Anwar Hossain had spent 22 years believing exactly that. Droid. He was a land surveyor in a delta town where the water moved more than the people did. Droid. Where fields turned into sandbars and sandbars turned into fields again with a patience that outlasted every human plan drawn on top of them. Droid. His office was a narrow room above a tea stall, its walls covered in maps he had drawn himself, each one a careful record of Droid. Boundaries, plots, and property lines that families paid him to certify. He had built his reputation on precision. Droid. Farmers trusted his numbers the way they trusted the call to prayer, as something fixed in a world that otherwise refused to sit still. Droid. He measured with a theodolite his father had once used, and later with a GPS unit he had saved for 2 years to buy. Droid. And in both cases he treated the resulting figures as facts rather than approximations. This was not arrogance so much as necessity. Droid. A surveyor who doubted his own lines could not feed a family. Droid. He had grown up on the western bank in a house his grandfather built from timber and tin on land that had belonged to the family for 3 generations. Droid. As a boy, he watched his father walk the boundary posts every monsoon, checking that the markers had not shifted. Droid. As if the act of checking were itself a kind of prayer. Anwar absorbed a lesson without being taught it directly. Droid. That the world could be pinned down if you were disciplined enough, if you measured carefully enough. Droid. If you refused to let assumption replace verification. He carried this lesson into his profession, and it served him well for a long time. Droid. People came to him not because he was the cheapest surveyor in the district, but because his lines held up in court, in family disputes. Droid. In the endless negotiations that happen when land is inherited among too many children. Droid. The trouble began the year the river decided, without asking anyone, to move nearly 400 meters to the east over the course of 2 monsoon seasons. Droid. This was not unheard of in that part of the country, but it had never happened to Anwar's own family plot before. Droid. And there is a difference between knowing a thing intellectually and having it happen to the ground your house stands on. Droid. The first season took the vegetable patch his mother had kept since before his birth. Droid. The second season took the boundary markers his father had walked for 40 years. By the time the water receded that autumn. Droid. The family home stood on a spit of land that the river had, for the moment, decided to leave alone. Droid. But the official plot lines that Anwar had certified for a dozen neighboring families no longer corresponded to anything visible on the ground. The paper said one thing, the land said another. Droid. He went out with his instruments the week after the water dropped. Droid. Expecting to re-establish the old lines by triangulating from the 2 surviving markers, and the mosque minaret that had always served as a fixed reference point in his calculations. Droid. He found that one of the 2 markers was gone entirely, dissolved into a new sandbar with no trace. Droid. And the other had shifted at an angle that made no geometric sense unless the ground beneath it had also moved, which of course it had. Droid. For the first time in his working life, Anwar stood in a field with his instruments and did not know what to write down. Droid. He sat on an overturned crate that had washed up somewhere from someone's kitchen and looked at the water for a long time. Droid. What unsettled him was not the loss of property, though that mattered too. It was the quieter, Droid, more corrosive realization that his entire method rested on an assumption he had never examined that there existed, somewhere beneath the shifting silt. Droid. A true and permanent line, and that his job was simply to find it and record it accurately. He had treated uncertainty as a temporary problem. Droid. Solvable with better instruments or more careful technique. Standing in that field, he began to suspect that the uncertainty was not temporary at all. Droid. It was the actual condition of the land. Droid. And every map he had ever drawn was a kind of fiction that people had agreed to believe in, because the alternative, admitting that nothing held still, droid, was too uncomfortable to live with. He did not share this thought with anyone at first. He went home, ate dinner with his wife and 2 children, droid, and said nothing about the missing markers beyond the practical fact that he would need to remeasure. His wife, Nazrin, droid, noticed only that he was quieter than usual, which she attributed to the stress of the flood damage, droid. In truth, he was turning over a question that had no easy shape. If his certainty had been an illusion all along, droid, what exactly had he been selling people for 22 years, droid? The neighboring families began arriving at his office within days, each wanting him to confirm that their plot was still where the paper said it was, droid. Anwar found himself in the strange position of a man whose entire professional identity was built on providing certainty, droid, now required to provide it to people who trusted him precisely because he had never before hesitated, droid. He remeasured the land 3 times using 3 different methods, and each time the numbers came out slightly different, droid. Not because he was making errors, but because the reference points themselves no longer agreed with one another, droid. 1/10 of a degree of angular difference here, a few centimeters of drift there, small enough to dismiss individually, but large enough, droid, compounded across the length of a field to shift a boundary by a meter or more, droid. He had encountered small discrepancies like this before in his career and had always resolved them by choosing the reading that matched what people expected, droid, telling himself this was reasonable judgment rather than convenient fiction. Now, for the first time, he could not make himself do that, droid. It felt like lying, even though nobody had ever accused him of lying, droid. Even though this was simply how surveying had always been practiced by everyone he knew, droid. He drove 2 hours to the district land office to consult an older colleague, droid, a retired surveyor named Rafiq, who had trained under British-era conventions before independence and had seen more river shifts than Anwar had years of life, droid. Rafiq listened to his account without much visible reaction, poured 2 cups of tea, droid, and told him something that Anwar would return to many times over the following months. He said that in this delta, droid, the paper had never actually described the land. The paper described an agreement among people about how to talk about the land, droid, an agreement useful for taxation, for inheritance, for avoiding daily violence over disputed rows of crops, droid. But the agreement was never the same thing as the ground itself, droid. Rafiq said this without any of the drama Anwar had expected from a revelation of that size. To him, it was simply how the profession worked, droid, had always worked, would go on working. Younger surveyors, he said, tended to confuse their tools for the truth, droid, and it usually took a bad flood or a bad divorce case to correct that confusion, droid. Anwar drove home, turning the conversation over in his mind, and what struck him most was Rafiq's lack of despair about it, droid. He had expected that admitting the illusion would collapse the whole enterprise, droid. That if certainty was fake, then the profession was fraudulent and should perhaps be abandoned, droid. Instead, Rafiq seemed to have made peace with practicing a discipline that produced useful approximations rather than fixed truths, and had built a long, droid, respected career on exactly that basis. This did not resolve Anwar's unease so much as give it a new shape, droid. The question was no longer whether certainty was an illusion. It clearly was, at least in the form he had been treating it, droid. The question was what to do with a profession and a life once you stopped pretending otherwise, droid. Over the following weeks, he began a private experiment that he told no one about, not even Nazrin, droid. Instead of recording a single boundary line for each disputed plot, he began recording a range, droid, a band of possible positions with the most likely line mark, but bracketed by the actual margin of uncertainty his instruments and reference points allowed. Droid. He knew this would not satisfy the families who wanted a single number to fight over or defend. So at first he kept these ranges in a private notebook. Droid. Separate from the official documents he issued. In the official paperwork he continued giving single lines as convention demanded. Droid. Because a farmer standing in front of a judge needs a number, not a probability distribution. Droid. But privately he began to think of every line he had ever drawn as an approximation dressed up as a fact. Droid. And this reframing changed something in how he worked. Slower at first, more careful in a different way than before. Droid. Checking not just his measurements, but the assumptions underneath them. Droid. The first real test of this new discipline came when two brothers, Kamal and Jason, Droid, brought him a dispute over 4 decimal of land that had reappeared after the river's retreat. Droid. Land that had belonged to their late father before the earlier erosion had taken it entirely. Now that it had resurfaced as new accretion. Droid. Both brothers claimed it under different interpretations of old inheritance documents. Droid. And both wanted Anwar to produce a survey that definitively supported their side. This was exactly the kind of situation where, a year earlier, Droid, Anwar would have quietly favored whichever interpretation seemed more socially convenient. The older brothers claimed by custom, say Droid, and called it objective measurement. Instead, he sat with both brothers for an afternoon and explained Droid, as plainly as he could without sounding like he was lecturing them, that the land in question had not existed in any fixed form 18 months earlier. Droid. That the old documents described a plot that the river had erased and only approximately restored. Droid. And that no measurement he could make would settle the moral question of whose land it should be. Droid. Only the physical question of where the current accretion sat relative to the surviving markers. He offered them his honest numbers. Droid, including the margin of uncertainty, and told them the rest was a decision they would have to make themselves. Droid. Ideally with an elder or a religious authority they both trusted, because his instruments could not adjudicate fairness. Droid. Kamal was angry at first. He had come expecting an ally, not an education, and he told Anwar bluntly that this was not what he was paying for. Droid. Anwar did not defend himself with authority the way he might once have, citing his years of experience or his instrument's precision. He simply repeated, Droid, calmly, that he could tell them what the ground currently was, and that pretending to more certainty, then that would be a disservice to both of them. Droid. Since whichever way he decided, one brother would end up believing a lie had been sold to him as fact. Jason, the younger brother, was quieter, Droid. And after a while he said that their father had always settled disputes among the workers on his land the same way, Droid, by admitting what he didn't know rather than pretending authority he didn't have. This seemed to shift something in the room. Droid. The brothers left without resolving the matter that day, but they left together, walking the same direction. Droid. Which was itself unusual given how the morning had started. Droid. This incident did not transform Anwar's business overnight, and he was wary, when he thought about it later, of describing it as any kind of turning point. Droid. Because turning points were exactly the kind of illusion he was now trying to unlearn. Droid. The idea that a life reorganizes itself around single dramatic moments rather than accumulating through many small, unremarkable choices. Droid. What changed was slower and less visible. He began teaching his eldest son, Rakib, who had shown interest in the family trade. Droid. Not just the technical operation of the instruments, but the discipline of naming uncertainty rather than hiding it. Droid. He found this harder to teach than the mathematics had ever been, because the boy, like Anwar himself at that age, wanted answers that stayed still. Droid. Rakib would ask why his father sometimes gave 2 numbers instead of 1. Droid. And Anwar had to resist the urge to simplify the answer into something falsely comforting. He told him instead that the land moved, droid, that maps were tools people used to live together peacefully on land that didn't care about their paperwork, droid, and that a good surveyor's job was not to erase that fact, but to work honestly within it, droid. Nazrin noticed the change in him gradually, more in his manner than in anything he said directly. He argued less at home about small certainties, droid, was slower to insist he was right in disagreements that didn't matter much, more willing to say he didn't know when he genuinely didn't know, droid, which she found, to her own surprise, made him easier to live with rather than harder, droid, since she no longer had to manage the gap between his declared confidence and his actual doubt. He did not become a passive man or an indecisive one, droid. If anything, the work required more decisiveness than before, since giving an honest range still meant committing to numbers, to recommendations, droid, to positions that people could act on. What had changed was that his confidence no longer depended on denying the limits of what he knew, droid. He began keeping a second set of notes, separate from his professional records, in which he wrote down other assumptions he had never questioned, droid, not about land, but about his own life. He had assumed his father's approval mattered more than his own judgment, droid, and had spent years deferring decisions to a version of his father's opinion that existed mostly in his own head, droid, since his father had been dead for 6 years and could no longer actually weigh in, droid. He had assumed that respect from his community depended on never admitting error, droid, and had spent energy defending small mistakes that would have cost him nothing to simply correct, droid. He had assumed that his religious practice required a kind of certainty about matters he privately found difficult, and found, droid. Once he allowed himself to sit with doubt, rather than suppress it, that his faith did not collapse under questioning the way he had feared, droid, but became a practice of showing up honestly rather than performing conviction he didn't fully possess. None of these realizations arrived as revelations, droid. They accumulated the way silt accumulates, one deposit at a time, invisible in any single season but undeniable across several, droid. The river shifted again the following year, less dramatically, droid, taking a smaller strip of land near the mosque and depositing new ground near the old ferry crossing, droid. This time Anwar did not experience the same disorientation he had the first time. He went out with his instruments, measured what could be measured, droid, marked the uncertainty honestly where it existed, and moved on to the next task, droid. The families who came to him no longer expected the false comfort of absolute lines. Word had spread, droid, in the slow way that reputation spread in small towns, that Anwar's numbers came with honesty attached. And this had, against his early fears, droid, made people trust him more rather than less. A number of neighboring surveyors in nearby unions began adopting versions of his practice, droid, not out of philosophical conviction, but because it reduced the disputes that came back to haunt them months later when a boundary they'd certified turned out to be wrong, droid. Rakib, now old enough to accompany his father on longer surveys, asked him one evening, as they walked home along the newly formed bank, droid, whether it ever bothered him that he could no longer be completely sure of anything in his work. Anwar considered the question seriously before answering, droid, since he no longer trusted himself to give a quick, reassuring response to a genuine question. He said that it had bothered him a great deal at first, droid, that losing the belief in fixed lines had felt like losing the ground itself, which was almost literally true, droid. But he had come to think that the discomfort of not knowing was preferable to the false comfort of a certainty that the world would eventually reveal to be untrue anyway, droid, usually at the worst possible moment, in front of a judge or across a table from an angry neighbor, droid. He told his son that most of what people called wisdom in this profession was not the ability to know more than others destroyed, but the willingness to say clearly what could and could not be known destroyed, and to keep working carefully within that boundary rather than pretending it didn't exist destroyed. They reached the house as the evening call to prayer sounded from the mosque destroyed, itself rebuilt slightly further inland than the original structure that the river had claimed 2 generations earlier destroyed, standing now on ground that had not existed in that form when Anwar's grandfather was a boy. Anwar found himself thinking, as he often did now, destroyed, that the mosque's new position was itself a kind of honest monument destroyed, not to permanence, but to the community's capacity to keep rebuilding meaning on ground that never stopped shifting under it destroyed. He did not think of this as a sad thought. It felt instead like the closest thing to solid understanding he had ever reached destroyed. The recognition that certainty was never the actual foundation anyone had been standing on, only a story told for convenience destroyed. And that a life built on acknowledging this honestly was, paradoxically, sturdier than one built on defending an illusion destroyed. He continued his work in the seasons that followed, remeasuring, revising, teaching his son the discipline of naming what he did not know destroyed. Sitting sometimes with families in the aftermath of disputes he could not fully resolve, offering them honest numbers instead of false comfort destroyed. He did not arrive at some final, settled peace with uncertainty, and he would have distrusted himself if he had destroyed, since a man who claims to have permanently solved his relationship with doubt has usually only found a new illusion to replace the old one destroyed. What he had instead was a practice repeated daily of checking his assumptions before trusting them destroyed, of holding his conclusions loosely enough to revise them when the ground beneath them shifted, which in that part of the world it eventually always did destroyed. The river kept moving, as it always had, and Anwar kept walking out to measure it, not because he expected to finally pin it down destroyed, but because the measuring itself, done honestly, had become the point.